Tonight, you're not watching heroes swing axes in slow motion. You're sitting in a dim Norse room where the loudest thing is a doorway that creaks once, just enough to remind everyone that Wood remembers. A fire pops politely, like it's trying not to interrupt. And on the table, the most dangerous object isn't a blade at all, but a small cloth pouch of silver that makes a soft, responsible clink, an invoice you can hear. Before you fall asleep, you'll follow a strange Viking truth. In a small world, a death doesn't end a story, it starts a debt. You'll watch how grief turns into questions that sound almost boring. Who witnessed it? Who will speak? Who will answer for it? You'll see how law tried to step between pride and revenge with deadlines, witnesses and public counting like a community building a fence inside the human heart. And you'll feel why the price tag isn't mercy, it's survival math. 3 small senses to keep you company. A doorway sighs and settles back into its hinge. A single coin taps another through cloth, careful as a secret. And the fire clears its throat once, then decides to behave. If your breathing wants a rhythm, take it. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If you like stories where history whispers instead of shouts, consider subscribing only if you want more nights like this. Quiet, detailed, and a little unsettling in the calmest way. And tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I love imagining the map of this story spreading out in real time, house by house, like news traveling along a fjord. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a raid. It begins with a room getting very still, a name becoming a question, and a community realizing the first question is not why, it asks who will pay for it. You might not expect a society famous for long ships and loud poetry to also be quietly obsessed with invoices, witnesses, and the correct way to count silver. But here we are, standing in a dim room where the most dangerous object on the table is not a blade, but a small pouch that makes a soft, responsible clink. The doorway creaks the way old wood always does, not because it wants attention, but because it cannot help being itself. The fire pops once, politely, like it is clearing its throat before it warms the room. And somewhere in the background, the world is doing what it always does at night, breathing, waiting, and pretending not to notice anything. Imagine a small Norse community, small enough that you can recognize footsteps in the snow, and also recognize the sound of someone trying to pretend they are not walking past your house. In that kind of place, a death is not a headline. It is a disturbance in the shape of the day. It is the way a door doesn't open when it usually does. It is the way someone looks at the floor a little longer than necessary, as if the floor might contain legal advice. News travels without needing to be loud. It moves through long houses and along paths by the water. It arrives in careful sentences. And the first question is rarely, why? Because why is large and slippery and hard to carry. The first question is more practical, the way sleepy minds become practical. Who saw it? Who can say it out loud? And who will answer for it? A body means grief, yes, but also a chain of names. A father's name, a brother's name, an uncle who has opinions, a cousin who likes to stand a little too close when he talks. In a world where family is not just a feeling, but a structure, a killing doesn't fall neatly onto one person like a coat. It spreads. It reaches into relationships and obligations. It wakes up old grudges that were previously napping. And the dangerous thing about a feud is not the first act. It is the second. It is the moment when someone decides that doing nothing would look weak. And weakness in a small world is the kind of rumor that never stops walking. So people try, in their very human way, to make revenge less convenient. Not kinder, not softer, just less likely to spiral into a long, chilly sequence of and then events. They made rules. They made deadlines. They made places where words had to be used before weapons could be used. It's almost adorable, in a grim administrative sort of way, that law shows up not as a gentle angel, but as a tired neighbor saying, "Fine, If you insist on being furious, at least do it on a schedule. They treated violence like a fire. It exists, you don't pretend it doesn't, but you try to keep it in a hearth instead of letting it climb the walls. And for that, you need procedure, which is a comforting word when you're sleepy because it sounds like someone is in charge, even if no one is. One of the calmest ideas, if you can call it calm, is that a death can become a debt. Not a debt that makes anyone happy, obviously. More like a debt that keeps everyone alive long enough to argue about it. This is where the pouch of coins becomes strangely important. Silver in these systems is not just shiny. It is a substitute. It is a way of saying, we acknowledge that something has been taken and we are going to try awkwardly to prevent more taking. It is not forgiveness. It is not forgetting. It is survival math done out loud in front of people who would prefer to be somewhere else, like home or asleep, or quietly pretending they are not related to anyone involved. The word you often meet here is wurgeld, a word that sounds like it should be the name of a sleepy house cat, but is instead a very serious concept, a person's man price, a value assigned for compensation. It is the price of a person in the specific sense that law can measure what grief cannot. And of course it gets complicated immediately because humans cannot resist complication. The amount depends on status, and status depends on land, and land depends on inheritance. And inheritance depends on who remembers what, and memory is a slippery witness. Some people are valued higher, some lower, and even if everyone pretends this is normal, it quietly reveals what the society admits when it thinks no one is listening. A free person is not valued like an enslaved person. A noble is not valued like a laborer. In some places, even the shape of your social connections changes the number, as if your friends are a part of your price tag. And while we're being mildly absurd, imagine trying to explain this to someone modern in the softest possible voice. Yes, we have a system where killing is discouraged by a payment schedule. It sounds like an insurance policy designed by poets and exhausted farmers. But it did something important. It replaced the immediate urge for retaliation with a slower, more bureaucratic process. Paying does not erase sorrow, but it signals something crucial. The killer's side admits there is a debt. That admission, spoken publicly, can cool a room that is close to burning. It is astonishing how much human behavior depends on whether someone says out loud, yes, we did wrong. Yes, we owe something. A lot of conflicts are fueled not only by loss, but by denial, which is like pouring oil on a quiet fire. Of course, a single person rarely pays alone. The idea of one guilty individual handing over a neat stack of coins is a lovely fantasy, like imagining everyone in a village agreeing on the correct way to store fish. In reality, families and allies contribute because the feud threatens everyone connected to the name. It becomes a community problem in the way a leaking roof becomes everyone else's problem once the water reaches the food. People gather silver from wherever they can. They borrow, they bargain, they turn objects into payments. They count and recount because miscounting is not just embarrassing, it can restart the whole nightmare. And if you want a micro hook to hold your attention for a moment, consider how many ancient disputes likely began with something like, I'm sure it was 3 more coins than that, followed by a long silence, followed by the sound of someone standing up too quickly. Payment also needs witnesses. In oral cultures, memory is not only a personal skill, it is a legal tool. If the law lives in people's mouths, then a deal must live there too. So settlements are witnessed, counted, and repeated like a careful chant you don't want to get wrong. Sometimes there are guarantors, people who stand behind the agreement like living locks, promising future payment or future obedience. You can almost see them in the firelight, trying to look steady, trying not to think about how they have just attached their reputation to someone else's behavior. It's a very human arrangement. I will vouch for this person, which is both noble and slightly foolish, like lending a book to someone who never returns books. And then there is the thing, which sounds like a vague word because it is, but in this context it is very specific. An assembly, a court, a gathering where disputes are brought into daylight. If you're imagining a courtroom with quiet chairs and a judge in a robe, you can gently let that image float away. Think instead of people standing, listening, weighing reputations, and trying to keep their voices controlled. The thing turns private fury into public performance, where words replace knives at least for a while. And the "at least for a while" part is important, because everyone knows the law is only as strong as the community's willingness to enforce it. And communities are famously inconsistent, especially when they're hungry, tired, or personally offended. At the Fang, men speak for their kin, recounting events with careful phrasing, because a single insult can restart violence like a spark in dry grass. The crowd is not neutral. It listens like a scale. It weighs alliances, past behavior, and the subtle question of who is more useful alive. You might think law is cold, but here it is, warm with human presence, warm with bias, warm with murmured agreement and quiet disapproval. It can feel like theater, and that is not a criticism. Theater is one of the oldest technologies for preventing people from immediately hitting each other. When everyone is watching, you have to behave as if you are being watched, which, inconveniently, you are. And there is something deeply sleepy, in a strange way, about the careful repetition of facts. Someone describes the time of day, the location, the witnesses, the sequence of movement, not because they love detail, but because detail is a rope you can hold on to when everything else feels like falling. You can hear the way a person tries to make their anger sound reasonable. You can hear the way another person tries to make their guilt sound small. You can hear the way language becomes a tool, sharpened not for poetry, but for survival. And if you drift a little here, that's fine. The cadence of legal talk is naturally soporific. It is designed to slow things down. It is designed to keep people from acting on the first impulse, which is usually the worst one. Still, the law has teeth because it must. When settlements fail, there is a darker option. Outlawry, the declaration that someone is outside the shield of society. An outlaw is not simply punished. He becomes legally vulnerable, a person anyone can harm without consequence. That is a terrifying concept precisely because it is so quiet. No dramatic execution scene required, no fireworks. Just the removal of protection, like taking a roof off a house and then calmly announcing that rain is now allowed. Exile can be framed as a compromise. The killer lives, but not here, not among these people, not under these rules. And that tells you something important about belonging in a small world. Belonging is the most valuable currency, and losing it is more frightening than losing silver. If you want another small, odd fact to hold on to before you sink deeper into the rhythm, consider how much of this system depends on geography and memory. In scattered settlements, distance is both a safety feature and a problem. If someone is outlawed, where do they go? Who will host them? Who will risk sharing food with a person who brings legal danger like smoke on their clothes? You can almost feel the social calculations happening in the background, quiet and constant. People are not only judging a person's act, they are judging the inconvenience of keeping that person around. And that's a very human kind of judgment, the sort you can imagine even in modern life, only with fewer axes and more group chats. Even when silver changes hands, the quiet cost remains. Trust does not return on schedule. Grief does not accept receipts. Families may agree in public and still carry private resentments that leak out years later in smaller conflicts, like water finding the tiniest crack. A feud can shrink into cold shoulders, broken marriage plans, a refusal to share a boat in winter, or the sudden decision that someone as sheep are wandering a little too close to the wrong boundary. Peace exists, but it is often a careful peace, a peace that needs maintenance the way a fire needs tending. And maintenance is a dull word, which is perfect, because so much of history is maintenance, keeping things from getting worse. Day after day, in ways no one writes heroic songs about, there's also the odd emotional paradox of settlement. On one level, it is relief. The room exhales. The obvious danger has been handled, at least publicly. On another level, it can feel unsatisfying because a number is not a person, and a pouch of silver is not a hand you can hold. The law does what it can. It takes a hot instinct and forces it into a colder shape. It asks people to live with an ending that is controlled, not comforting. And in a society where honor matters, accepting payment can itself be complicated. It can be interpreted as practical wisdom or as weakness, depending on who is whispering and how bored they are on a long winter night. So imagine the moment after a settlement when the pouch is tied shut and the witnesses nod, as if nodding can hold the agreement in place. The fire steadies. The voices lower. Someone clears their throat and suddenly doesn't know what to do with their hands, because anger was a task and now the task is over. People begin to drift toward the doorway, toward night air, toward home. A few phrases are repeated one more time, softly, to make sure everyone heard them the same way. The law has done its slow work, violence contained, not erased, like an axe put back on its hook where it can wait in silence. And if you let yourself linger there under the rafters, you can almost hear the strange calm of a community that has decided for now not to unravel itself. Not because anyone is suddenly gentle, not because anyone has forgotten anything, but because everyone has agreed publicly to carry the weight differently. The night keeps the names, the snow keeps the footprints, the silver keeps its faint, patient sound. And you can keep listening, or you can let the room go quiet around you, as if the world is still negotiating, very slowly, to remain at peace until morning. You might not expect the most awkward part of a Viking era killing to be the paperwork, but in a surprising number of Norse communities, the truly suspenseful sound was not a sword leaving a sheath, but coins settling into a cloth pouch with a resigned little clink, like metal sighing. A doorway creaks. A fire pops once, politely, as if it wants to contribute but not interrupt. And somewhere outside, the night keeps doing its simple job, which is to be cold and quiet and full of people pretending they are not thinking about anything. If you're listening from a bed or a sofa or the kind of chair that turns into a bed after you surrender, then you're exactly where you need to be. And if you are still awake by the time we reach the part where grown adults negotiate the value of a human life in units of silver, you can subscribe. Or don't. I will not send a longship after you. This is a very low pressure arrangement, like a candle that's happy simply to exist. In a small Norse settlement, a killing is never only one person falling. It is two families waking up. News travels quickly through longhouses and along the edges of fjords, carried by careful voices and people who suddenly have reasons to visit their cousins. The first question is rarely why, because why is a large and slippery thing. The second question arrives almost immediately, practical and slightly panicked. Who will answer for it? Because in a community where names are not just labels, but whole networks, a death pulls on strings you didn't realize were tied together. A brother feels it. An uncle with a loud opinion feels it. A friend of a friend feels it. Even the neighbor who pretends to be neutral feels it, because neutrality is difficult when everyone shares the same winter. A feud begins in that quiet space where grief meets pride and nobody offers a bridge. The danger is not only anger, but momentum. One insult becomes a memory. One memory becomes a reason. One reason becomes an excuse to stand a little too close to someone at the market, or to let your voice get just slightly sharper than necessary. And then, without anyone announcing it, the feud becomes a routine, like an old song everyone knows and wishes they didn't. It is strange, in a sleepy way, how human beings can turn emotional chaos into a schedule. There is the day you mention it, the day you brood, the day you decide you must do something, and do something is rarely a calm activity. So law in these places did something very Norse and very practical. It didn't pretend violence was a rumor that would go away if you ignored it. Instead, it tried to contain it. It offered channels, deadlines, and public procedures like a set of wooden rails on a dangerous path. If killing had consequences that could be negotiated, then maybe a community could avoid becoming its own battlefield. The law tried to stop the spiral, not with a gentle speech, but with structure. It is not mercy. It is survival math. It is the legal version of saying, if you absolutely must be furious, could you at least be furious in a way that doesn't destroy the whole village? And this is where the idea appears, soft-footed but significant. A death can become a debt. Not a debt that makes anyone feel better, and certainly not a debt that fits into a tidy moral box, but a debt that can be counted. A debt that can be acknowledged in public. A debt that forces people to talk instead of immediately swinging. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the tone shift from raw grief to something colder and more procedural. Not because anyone has healed, but because procedure is sometimes the only thing keeping everyone from lighting the roof on fire. The system that carries this awkward hope is Wergold, the man price, which sounds like a term invented by someone who needed to name an unpleasant reality before breakfast. Wergold is compensation paid to the victim's kin, meant to replace revenge with settlement, at least on paper and at least long enough for everyone to breathe again. The amount depends on status, relationships, and local custom, which means the value is political as much as economic. This is one of those moments where history quietly admits what it believes. Some lives are counted higher, some lower. It's not a comfortable fact, but it is a very common one, and it sits there like a cold stone in the mouth of the story. Pain does not erase sorrow, and it doesn't turn tragedy into a neat transaction like buying wool. But it signals something crucial. The killer's side admits a debt exists, and that admission can cool a room that is close to burning. Human beings, even when they are very proud, are oddly sensitive to whether the other side acknowledges reality. Denial makes grief sharper. Admission, even without warmth, can make anger slightly more manageable. It's not happiness. It is just the difference between a fire that spreads and a fire that stays inside the hearth. The silver itself becomes a character in the room, not a dramatic character. A dull, heavy character. The kind that sits quietly and changes everything without raising its voice. It has to be gathered because a single man rarely pays alone. Family and allies contribute because the feud threatens everyone connected to the name. People borrow, people trade. People do small calculations that feel almost modern, like deciding which objects can be turned into money without ruining daily life. And then they count again. They count slowly because getting the number wrong is not just embarrassing. It can restart the whole conflict, like accidentally stepping on a sleeping dog and then discovering the dog is actually several dogs. Sometimes the payment isn't even just coins. It can be weighed silver, rings, valuables, anything that can be agreed upon is worth something. Which means there's a quiet moment where everyone has to pretend that value is objective. Even though it clearly isn't, one person stares at a piece of silver like it's insulting them. Another person stares back like they're trying not to blink first. Someone clears their throat. Someone says very calmly that the weight is correct. And everyone pretends that calm is a natural state rather than an exhausting performance. And because this is an oral culture in many places, memory is not only personal, it is legal. Payments are witnessed, counted, and remembered because the agreement has to live in people's mouths. Witnesses matter the way locks matter. They hold the deal shut. Sometimes guarantors stand behind the agreement like human door bolts, promising future payment or future obedience. It's an odd job being a guarantor. You are basically saying, I trust this person enough to attach my reputation to their behavior, which is always a gamble, whether you're in the 9th century or on a group project. If you're looking for a small, sleepy micro hook to keep your mind gently engaged, imagine how many serious feuds probably paused for a deeply mundane argument about counting. Someone insists the silver is short. Someone insists it isn't. Someone suggests recounting. Everyone sighs. The recount happens anyway. No one laughs, but the absurdity hovers in the air like smoke. Yes, the room seems to say, we are managing vengeance with arithmetic. It is not poetic, but it is effective enough to be repeated. When those negotiations need a public stage, there is the thing, the assembly, the court-like gathering that turns private fury into public performance. It's less like a modern courtroom and more like a pressure valve. It brings rage into daylight. Words replace knives, at least for a while. Men speak for their kin, recounting events with careful phrasing, because a single insult can restart violence like a spark in dry straw. People listen. People weigh. The crowd is not neutral. It listens like a scale, measuring reputation, alliances, and risk. In this setting, law can feel like theater, but theater can keep blood off the floor. It's hard to do something reckless when everyone is watching you do it. The slow rhythm of a thing is almost designed for sleep. Someone speaks. Someone responds. A small correction is made. A detail is repeated. The location, the time, the witness. It's as if facts are being laid down like planks, one by one, to build a path across a swamp of emotion. And it's oddly soothing, the way repetition creates structure. Even anger has to follow a pattern here. Even outrage has to wait its turn, which is not something outrage enjoys, but it's something communities require if they want to survive. The thing is also where the law shows its darker tools, because not every conflict can be settled with silver and nods. When settlement fails, there is outlawry. The law can declare someone outside the shield of society. An outlaw is not simply punished. He becomes legally vulnerable, a person anyone can harm without consequence. It's a terrifying idea precisely because it is so quiet. No dramatic moment required, just the removal of protection, like taking away a roof and calmly informing you that rain is now allowed. Exile can be framed as a compromise. The killer lives, but not here, not among these people, not under these rules. And that tells you something about a small world. Belonging is a currency. Losing it is a kind of social death that lingers. Even that, though, has its own sleepy bureaucracy. Where does an outlaw go? Who dares to host him? Who decides that mercy is worth the risk? You can almost feel the calculations happening in the background, not spoken aloud, but heavy in every pause. People don't only judge the act. They judge the inconvenience of having the consequences nearby. They judge whether keeping a person around will pull the feud back into the village like smoke returning through a crack. It is all very human and all very tiring, and the tiredness is part of the point. The law makes vengeance inconvenient on purpose. And then, after the public words and the counting and the witness nods, there's the quiet cost of settling. Even when silver changes hands, trust does not return on schedule. Grief doesn't accept receipts. Families may agree in public and still carry private resentments that leak out years later in smaller conflicts. A feud can shrink into cold shoulders, broken marriage plans, a refusal to share a boat in winter, or the sudden belief that someone's sheep are trespassing with suspicious confidence. Peace exists, but it is often a careful peace, a peace that needs maintenance the way a fire needs tending. And maintenance is one of the most boring forces in history, which is exactly why it shapes so much of it. There's also the strange emotional contradiction of compensation. On one level, it is relief. The room exhales. The immediate danger is contained. On another level, it can feel hollow, because a number is not a person, and silver is not a voice that returns. The law has done what it can, which is to take a hot instinct and press it into a colder, controlled ending. It doesn't ask people to stop feeling. It asks them to stop multiplying their feelings into more bodies. And that is a low, practical kind of success, the kind that never becomes a heroic saga, but keeps the community intact long enough for spring to arrive. So imagine the moment after a settlement, when the pouch is tied shut and the witnesses nod, and the room tries to breathe normally again. The fire steadies, the voices lower. Someone suddenly doesn't know what to do with their hands because anger was a task, and now the task is finished, at least in public. People drift toward the doorway. Someone repeats the terms one more time, softly, to make sure the agreement has lodged itself in everyone's memory. Outside, the night doesn't celebrate or judge. It simply holds the village in its cold palm, while everyone pretends to be calmer than they are. Let the final feeling be quiet and a little uneasy at once. Violence contained, not erased, like an axe put back on its hook where it can wait in silence. The coins rest, the names rest for now. The law rests because it has done its slow, dull work. And if you're growing heavy with sleep, you can let the room fade gently around you. The steady fire, the softened voices, the pouch that no longer clinks. While the night keeps the agreement in place, not with drama, but with the patient, boring weight of time. You might not expect one of history's quietest inconveniences to be the simple act of paying for something. Not stealing it, not conquering it, not dramatically declaring it yours. Just paying, handing over money. And yet, for a stretch of time in early modern Sweden, money could mean a flat, heavy sheet of copper so large that it made the average pocket feel like a cruel joke someone told on purpose. A fire settles, a floorboard size. Somewhere, a small pouch of ordinary coins feels smug for being small. And the night, as usual, offers you the comfort of not asking you to carry anything. Before we drift too far, notice where you are listening from. A bed, a couch, a chair that is trying its best. And what time is it there? Late enough that your brain deserves gentler topics like bureaucrats, metal, and the slow defeat of human wrists. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe. Or don't. I promise I will not send a government clerk to your home with a stamp and a disappointed expression. We'll keep it informal, like a candle that doesn't demand applause. Now, imagine you live in a place where copper is plentiful, but silver small, convenient, satisfying silver is more scarce than people would like. Sweden had a lot of copper, and in the 17th century, that was both a blessing and a kind of long-term practical prank. Copper is useful. Copper can be turned into many things. Pots, kettles, roofing bits, church bells, tools. And if you are determined enough, money. The trouble is that copper is not as value-dense as silver, which is a calm way of saying you need more of it to represent the same worth. A lot more. Enough more that money stops being a little symbol you carry and starts becoming an object that changes your posture. So Sweden did something that feels like a quiet experiment conducted by people who were only half aware they were testing the limits of daily life. They minted copper coinage, and then, more famously, they made copper plate, money-big rectangular plates called plautmynt. These weren't cute. They weren't charming little tokens. They were slabs. They looked like someone took a piece of a roof, flattened it, and then stamped it with official marks to convince you it was a coin and not a building supply with delusions. And those stamps mattered. The plate money was authenticated with several stamped seals, often one in each corner and one in the center, like an anxious official. Signing the same form 5 times just to feel safe, the stamp said, in effect, "Yes, this is money. We have decided it. Please do not question it too loudly." There's something deeply soothing about that, in a weary way. A government trying to solve a monetary problem with extra stamping. If you've ever received an email with 3 exclamation points where one would do, you understand the emotional logic. The values could be significant. Some plates represented large denominations, which meant the coin itself had to be physically large and heavy enough to match that value in copper. There were different sizes for different amounts, and the larger ones were the kind of object you don't misplaced so much as you misstore. Nobody forgets where a large copper plate is. You remember it the way you remember a table. You don't wonder where it went. You wonder where you can put it without rearranging your life. If you're re-looking for a small micro hook to keep your mind gently awake, but not too awake, imagine the quiet social awkwardness of payment. You go to buy something ordinary, grain, cloth, a pair of shoes, something humble, and you arrive with what looks like part of a door. The seller looks at you. You look at the seller. The seller looks at your money again, as if hoping it will shrink out of politeness. And then both of you enter the slow world of practical problems. Where to set it down, how to verify the stamps, whether your back will complain about this later. Carrying the plates was its own sleepy saga. People used bags, sleds, carts, and the strength of resignation. It wasn't necessarily that everyone walked around with huge plates all the time, but the mere existence of such currency changed the background texture of trade. Money was no longer just a concept in your purse. Money could be furniture adjacent. Money could be noisy if you dropped it. Money could bruise a toe. And all of this had a subtle psychological effect. It made spending feel heavier, literally. There's nothing like lifting your payment to inspire a sudden interest in saving. Of course, the whole point of money is to make exchange easier than bartering. But this kind of money, while official and standardized, brought back a faint flavor of barter simply because it was so object-like. A copper plate is not a number. It is a thing. It has edges. It has weight. It has the faint personality of metal that has been handled too much. And if you've ever tried to make a quick purchase while holding something awkward, you know how a transaction can turn into a minor event. Not because of drama, but because of logistics. Behind all of this sat the larger world of state finance, trade balances, and the restless need of governments to pay for things that governments always seem to pay for. Wars, administration, ships, salaries, fortifications, and the ever-growing pile of responsibilities that comes with having a kingdom instead of a quiet garden. Copper plate money helped address coin shortages and allowed Sweden to use its copper resources. It was a solution that worked in its own heavy way, and like many workable solutions, it introduced new problems that felt almost like jokes told by reality. For instance, consider the simple act of making change. If you pay with a large copper plate, how do you get change back without the entire shop turning into a small warehouse? You can imagine smaller copper coins being used for everyday transactions and the plates for larger sums. But even so, the presence of these plates in the system meant that large payments had a physical presence that demanded planning. It's like paying your rent with a stack of encyclopedias. It might be possible. It will not be elegant. And everyone involved will need a moment. There's also the matter of trust, because money relies on shared belief. Everyone has to agree that the stamped metal is worth what it says it's worth. With plate money, the stamps were the reassurance, the official whisper that says, "We promise this is legitimate." But people are people, and people notice things like wear, damage, and the general fact that copper is copper, and copper can be melted down. Which means that, in the background, there is always a soft hum of questions. Is this plate full weight? Are the stamps clear? Has it been altered? Is it counterfeit? Is it worth more as raw metal than as money? These are not exciting questions. They are the kind of questions that make you sleepy because they sound like someone reading a long checklist in a dim office. And yet, those questions matter, because when the value of the metal and the face value drift apart too much, strange incentives appear. If copper prices rise, a plate might be tempting as material. If copper prices fall, carrying it feels like hauling sadness. Either way, the economy becomes a place where objects and abstractions tug at each other in slow motion. It's almost peaceful in the way a river is peaceful when you're not the one trying to cross it. Now let the scene drift gently from the minted plates themselves to the human habits that form around them. People adapt, they always do. A merchant might keep sturdy storage. A household might set aside a specific spot for the larger pieces, like a corner that becomes unofficially the money corner. Someone might joke, softly, that their savings could be used to patch a roof. Someone else might not joke and simply nod because, yes, technically, it could. There is something very bedtime friendly about that kind of humor. Not loud, just a small dry observation that sits on your tongue and then disappears. Think too about travel. If you are moving goods, you already have wagons and horses and ropes and all the gentle chaos of transport. If you are moving large amounts of money in copper plates, you are transporting value in a form that is not discreet. A small purse can hide under a cloak. A copper plate cannot. It announces itself. It says, "Hello, I am wealth, and I am also inconvenient." That changes the feeling of security. It changes the planning. It changes how a person walks. Because a person walking with a plate money is walking with responsibility that has corners. And in the middle of all this, there is the quiet reality that many people, even then, lived closer to subsistence than to abstract financial systems. For them, money, whether coin or plate, was one part of life's negotiation. You paid taxes, you paid rents, you paid fees, you paid fines. There is a soothing monotony to this because it reminds you that history is often made of repeated small obligations. The grand events sit on top, but underneath, people are always paying for something, always being told what they owe, always counting what they have. It's like breathing, but with more paperwork. If you want a slightly modern analogy, very soft and quiet, imagine a world where your phone is also your wallet, except the phone weighs as much as a small baking tray and needs 2 hands. That's the mood. Not exact, but emotionally correct. You can still live your life. You just do it slower and with more awareness of gravity. Eventually, Sweden's money story shifts again, because economies keep changing like weather. New institutions appear. Banking develops. Paper notes begin to play a larger role, which is a relief to everyone's spine. And here is a wonderfully sleepy irony. One reason paper money becomes attractive is that it is light. Not morally lighter, physically lighter. You can move large value without moving large metal. This feels obvious now, but at the time it was a significant change in daily convenience. It is like discovering you don't have to carry your entire pantry to prove you own food. Sweden is often mentioned in the history of early banknotes, and the transition from heavy copper to paper is one of those quiet revolutions that doesn't have a single dramatic scene. No one stands on a hill and declares, "Let us now embrace lightness." Instead, people notice that paper is easier. Officials notice that paper can circulate differently. Merchants notice that their carts can carry goods instead of money. And the general population notices, perhaps without saying it out loud, that their shoulders are grateful. History sometimes advances through the simple desire to stop carrying heavy things. Still, the copper plates don't vanish instantly. They linger because systems have inertia, and because metal has a way of staying present even when ideas move on. Some plates survive into museums and collections, where they look even more absurd to modern eyes because modern money has become so small, so symbolic, so nearly invisible. A copper plate in a display case looks like a prank artifact from a world where convenience was optional. But it wasn't a prank. It was a sincere attempt to make an economy function with the resources available. And sincerity is what makes it so quietly funny. There's also the tender detail that these plates often carry the marks of use, scratches, wear, the soft edges of handling. A little evidence that real people picked them up and set them down and worried over them and tried not to drop them on their feet. Money is often treated as an abstract force, but a plate reminds you it is also a physical object that participates in the daily life of hands. And hands, as we know, get tired. Hands want to rest. Hands want to hold something warm instead of something that feels like winter. So if your mind is still wandering, let it wander into a small, ordinary Swedish interior, a wooden table, a faint smell of smoke, a person laying down a copper plate not with triumph, but with a careful, practiced motion that suggests they have done this before and would prefer not to do it again. Someone checks the stamps, someone nods. A transaction completes. Nobody cheers, nobody cries. The world continues. Outside, the dark is quiet. Inside, a fire pops once. It's the same sound it has always been. And that, in its boring reliability, is exactly why it's comforting. Let the ending be soft. Not a conclusion, just a gentle settling. Imagine the plate money put away, the ledger closed, the hands warmed near the hearth. Imagine the weight of the day easing off, not because problems are solved forever, but because nighttime is good at asking less of you. The copper can rest. The numbers can rest. The stamps can rest. And you can rest too, letting the whole strange idea money you could almost use as a tray fade into the background, like the last clink of metal in a pouch, growing quieter until it becomes nothing at all. You might not expect a society famous for ships, axes, and dramatic weather to spend so much time doing something as quiet as accounting. But here we are, in a world where a death could become a debt, and where the most important sound in the room might not be a shout, but the soft clink of silver being counted twice, just to be sure. A doorway creaks somewhere in the dark. A fire pops once, politely, like it doesn't want to wake anyone. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear coins shifting in a cloth pouch, the way a small animal shifts in its sleep. Before we drift into it, notice where you are and what time it is. Late enough that your brain deserves something slow, something detailed, and gently pointless. So let's give it exactly that. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part where men argue about numbers in public, you can subscribe. Or don't. Nobody will declare you an outlaw for refusing. The only consequence will be that you might miss a future episode about taxes on candles or the social politics of cheese. And that's a risk you may be willing to take. In a small Norse community, a killing is never only one person falling. It's two families waking up at the same time in the same cold, with two completely different versions of what must happen next. News travels quickly in places where there are not many places to travel. It moves through long houses and along paths, carried by the careful tone people use when they are trying to be accurate and also not become the next problem. Someone saw something. Someone heard something. Someone's cousin's neighbor knows a detail that may or may not be true, but it arrives in your ear anyway, because rumor is the oldest postal service and it never takes a day off. The first question people like to imagine is why, because it sounds deep and tidy. But the second question arrives much faster, and it is much more practical, almost rude in its efficiency. Who will answer for it? Who will stand up and say, yes, this happened, and yes, it has a price, and yes, we can keep it from becoming a chain of new graves. The feuds people talk about are not just explosions of rage. They are also long projects of pride. They are schedules. They are memory maintained like a tool. A man's name matters, and a family's name matters, and an insult can sit on a table for months like a bowl nobody wants to wash. So the law, in its patient way, tries to step between the grief and the pride. Not because the law is sentimental. The law is rarely sentimental. The law is more like a fence, not beautiful, not emotional, just there to stop things from rolling downhill too fast. Instead of pretending violence doesn't exist, it gives it channels, deadlines, witnesses, and procedures. And if you've ever watched two people argue more calmly once a third person starts writing things down, you already understand the general psychology. Paper is not magical, but it is strangely sobering. In these societies, compensation could replace revenge, at least on paper and often in practice, because practice is what keeps communities from breaking apart. That compensation is what we call worgold, a word that sounds like a small animal, but is actually a concept that sits heavily on a room. Worgold is the man price, the value placed on a person in legal terms paid to the victim's kin. It is meant to say, not "this is fine," because it isn't, but "this has been acknowledged in a way that allows us to keep living next to each other." It is a payment that admits a debt exists, and sometimes just admitting that debt can cool a room that is close to burning. The amount wasn't the same for everyone, and that in itself is a detail that can make your mind feel a little drowsy because it turns human life into a spreadsheet. Status mattered, rank mattered, free or not free, powerful or not powerful, connected or not connected. The value was political as much as it was economic, which means that in the background, every payment also says something about the social map. Who counts, how much, and in what way. It's not romantic. It's not inspiring. It's just the quiet structure of a world trying to measure itself. And the payment was rarely done by one person alone, because a single man's purse often could not carry a single man's consequences. Family and allies contribute, friends contribute, people who owe favors contribute, people who don't want a feud to spread into their own lives contribute. There is a communal quality to it that is both practical and slightly weary, like everyone is slowly realizing they are all on the same small island of problems. The killer site gathers what they can: silver, goods, sometimes livestock, sometimes other forms of wealth depending on place and time, and they bring it into the open. Because public matters. These were cultures with strong oral traditions where memory wasn't just nostalgia, it was a legal tool. Payments are witnessed, counted, and remembered because a remembered payment is harder to deny later. If you want a gently modern analogy, think of it as the world's oldest receipt system, except the receipt is a group of serious people saying, "Yes, I saw the coins. Yes, I saw the hands. Yes, this happened." There is no printer. There is only reputation. And reputation in a small community is a kind of currency that never stops circulating. Sometimes there were guarantors too, people who stood behind the agreement like human logs, promising future payment or future obedience if the full sum couldn't appear immediately. It sounds formal, but it also sounds deeply human. A compromise made out of limited resources and a strong desire not to be stabbed later. The money itself is important, but the public agreement is often even more important because it declares an ending. It says, softly but firmly, "This matter has a border. This will not expand forever, at least not if everyone behaves." Of course, not everyone behaves. And sometimes the law has to offer darker tools, not because it enjoys them, but because it is trying to keep the system credible. That's where the thing comes in, the assembly where disputes are brought into daylight. The thing is not a single building. It's more like a social technology, a gathering, a recognized place and time where people can speak and be heard, and where the community can act like a community instead of a collection of private grudges. It turns rage into a performance of words, where words replace knives, at least for a while. In that setting, careful phrasing becomes survival. Men speak for their kin, recounting events with detail and a kind of strategic honesty, because a single insult can restart the violence, and a single exaggeration can make you look like someone who cannot be trusted. The crowd listens, but not neutrally. A crowd is never neutral. A crowd is a scale. It weighs reputation, alliances, history, and risk all at once, like a sleepy judge with a very long memory. And because everyone knows they may need that same crowd someday, they pay attention in a particular way, quietly, intensely, and with just enough boredom to feel normal. Law in this world can feel like theater, but it is theater with consequences, which is the best kind if you want people to stay seated. There are rules about who speaks when, how claims are made, how oaths are taken, and how settlements are confirmed. There is a rhythm to it, repetitive and procedural, and that rhythm is part of what makes it work. Repetition makes things feel real. It makes them feel stable. It makes them feel like something you can lean on, even if you are leaning on it because the alternative is chaos. And then there is the option that sits at the edge of the system like a cold draft, outworry. When settlements fail, when a person refuses the decision or breaks the peace too openly, the community can declare someone outside the shield of society. An outlaw is not simply punished. An outlaw becomes legally vulnerable, a person anyone can harm without legal consequence. It's a harsh concept, but it is also, in a blunt way, logical. If belonging is the most valuable currency in a small world, then removing belonging is the strongest threat the law can offer. Outlawry can also be framed as a compromise. The killer lives, but not here. Not among these people, not under these rules, not under this roof smoke and this set of expectations. Exile becomes a way to end the immediate danger without pretending forgiveness has arrived. It's not gentle, but it is an ending of a sort. The kind of ending that looks like someone walking into the distance with a bag that contains their life and nothing else. Even if this all sounds stern, notice how much of it is actually about preventing further violence rather than celebrating it. The law is trying to keep blood off the floor by giving anger something else to do. Talk, count, swear, sign with witnesses, accept deadlines, accept payments, accept public endings. It's a strange kind of peace, and peace in history is often strange. It is often a careful peace. A peace that exists because everyone is tired enough to want it. Now let your attention drift to the quiet cost of settling, because the end of a case is not always the end of a feeling. Even when silver changes hands, trust does not return on schedule. Grief does not accept receipts. A family might agree publicly and still carry private resentments that leak out years later in smaller conflicts. The feud can shrink into cold shoulders, broken marriage plans, a refusal to share a boat in winter, a sudden silence when someone's name is mentioned. Sometimes peace exists, but it is the careful kind of peace that needs maintenance, like a roof that will leak if you stop paying attention. And the irony is that the law is solution, turning a death into a debt, can feel both practical and unsettling. Practical, because it prevents more deaths. Unsettling, because it admits the world is willing to measure a person in silver. But the law is not trying to be poetic. It is trying to be survivable. The price tag is not mercy. It is survival math. It's a community saying we cannot undo what happened, but we can keep it from happening again and again and again, like a song nobody asked for, but everyone is forced to hear. If your mind wants another small micro-hook, consider the sheer administrative effort involved. Someone has to know the rates. Someone has to remember what a particular status costs. Someone has to count. Someone has to witness. Someone has to stand there and be solemn while coins are placed in a pile. It's the kind of moment that is half legal ritual, half awkward transaction, and fully human. Imagine paying for something enormous and emotional with the same gestures you use to buy ordinary things. Placing objects down, looking at the other person's face, waiting for a nod. It's almost unbearably mundane, which is exactly why it works as bedtime history. And in the longhouse, after the settlement, there is the quiet aftermath that doesn't make it into heroic stories. The pouch is tied shut. The witnesses nod, not happily, but with the exhausted approval of people who are glad the night will remain quiet. The law has done what it can, turned a hot instinct into a colder, controlled ending. Violence contained, not erased, like an axe put back on its hook. Not gone, just not swinging. So let the final feeling be calm and uneasy at once, the way a fire is calm when it has settled into coals. The doorway that creaked earlier is still there. The room still smells of smoke and wool and human breath. The voices lower. The coins stop moving. And whatever names were spoken tonight, names of the dead, names of the living, names that carry old weight, remain in the air for a moment, and then fade into the dark as the night keeps them quietly without commentary. And you can let your mind drift onward, slower and softer, as if this conversation could continue forever, but doesn't need to. You might not expect one of history's as quieter battles to be fought over something as gentle as daylight, but there was a time when light. Entering your house could be treated like a luxury measured in rectangles and taxed accordingly. Not the kind of rectangle you admire, just the kind you forget is there until someone turns it into a number. And once it becomes a number, it becomes a small, persistent problem like a pebble in a shoe, except the pebble is in your wall, and the wall is your entire house. It helps to imagine a street that is almost asleep, doors closed, a little smoke from chimneys that has decided to behave. Somewhere a ledger opens with the soft sound of paper being told to sit still. And if you listen carefully, you can hear an inspector's pencil moving, the way a pencil moves when it is very confident that counting is a form of authority. Where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Late enough, I hope, that the idea of counting windows feels soothing rather than insulting. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part where people literally build bricks to avoid paying for sunshine, you can subscribe. Or don't, it's not a tax. It is more of a polite suggestion that you might enjoy future episodes about other things nobody asked to be regulated, like hats, soap, or the exact number of buttons you're allowed to pretend are decorative. The basic idea was simple in that wonderfully inconvenient way governments sometimes achieve. In several places in early modern, Europe, most famously in Britain, tax policy drifted toward the home itself as a visible sign of wealth. Income can hide, goods can be moved, but a house sits there stubbornly in public with its little features on display. And windows, in particular, were visible, countable, and in the imagination of lawmakers connected to comfort. If you can afford more rooms, you probably have more windows. If you have more windows, you are probably not starving. That was the logic, anyway, which is the kind of logic that sounds neat from a distance and becomes irritating up close, like a perfectly folded map that does not match the actual street. So daylight becomes an indirect measurement of status. A home with many windows looks prosperous. A home with few windows looks modest. And prosperity in the eyes of a tax collector can feel like a gentle invitation. The tax is not framed as a punishment, of course. It's framed as fairness. Fairness has a way of arriving with paperwork. The tax becomes one of those policies that sits quietly in the background of daily life, shaping choices without needing to shout. People still wake up. People still cook. People still complain about weather. But now they also think about windows with a new kind of mental tension, the way you think about a subscription you forgot you signed up for. The truly sleepy absurdity is that a window is a hole in a wall, and holes are usually free. Nature provides holes very generously. But the state, being the state, looks at the hole and says, yes, but this hole is organized. This hole has glass. This hole has frames and hinges and the audacity to be pleasant. So the hole becomes taxable. And once a hole becomes taxable, the whole house becomes a kind of quiet argument with the government fought in masonry. To make this work, someone has to define what counts as a window. You can almost feel your eyelids getting heavier as the bureaucracy wakes up. Is a small window still a window? What about a window that doesn't open? What about a window that used to be a window but is now sort of a memory of a window? Sometimes rules try to be precise, and sometimes they simply pretend precision is possible and move on. Counting windows is one of those tasks that seems straightforward, until you meet a house with unusual design choices or a family with a strong motivation to be creative. This is where the inspector enters like a character in a very dull play. He arrives not with a sword, but with a list. Not with a drum, but with a sense of purpose. He walks down a street and looks up at buildings in the way you look up at a menu when you don't want to spend money. He is not admiring architecture, he is translating architecture into revenue. He counts openings, he checks, he confirms. The pencil moves. The ledger accepts the numbers without emotion. And in that moment, a home becomes a set of counted rectangles instead of a place where people keep their socks. There's something oddly intimate about it. Someone you do not know is evaluating your house by staring at it. Not to compliment it, not to buy it, not to borrow a cup of anything, but to assess how much light you are apparently allowed to enjoy. It's a form of attention that feels both petty and powerful, and it encourages a particular kind of behavior. People begin to design and modify their homes with the inspector's eyes in mind. The way modern people sometimes decorate for resale value, except the resale value here is less tax, please. So you get bricked up windows, real ones, not metaphorical. Actual openings filled with brick or stone, sometimes neatly, sometimes with a kind of rush practicality that suggests the homeowner did not have time to become an artist about it. From the outside, the house begins to look like it's slowly blinking. A window disappears, another one disappears. The building's face changes, not because of taste, but because of math. You can walk through older streets and still see these. Traces patches where a window used to be a different texture in the wall, a rectangle of slightly mismatched brick that looks like the house tried to erase part of itself. Inside, the consequences are quieter but more constant. Rooms become darker, corners become less friendly. The idea of a bright space becomes something you pay for, not something you simply have. If you want a gentle modern analogy, imagine someone charging you extra each month for the number of apps on your phone that can open a window. Not even the view. Just the ability to open it. You would eventually start deleting apps. People did the same thing, but with literal windows, which is both funnier and slightly tragic in a very calm way. And of course, people find loopholes because people always do. They rearrange. They rename, they argue about definitions. They discover that a small opening might not count, or that a window placed in a certain way might be overlooked, or that a particular official might be persuaded to count differently if greeted with the right tone and the right amount of patience. Not every case is dramatic. Most are probably just tedious. A household deciding whether the comfort of light is worth the cost. A family discussing it over a table in the same voice they use to discuss the price of flour. Not heroic. Just living. Meanwhile, the policy sits there with its neat intention, tax wealth without directly asking about income. But the real world does what it always does. It complicates the neat intention. A tax designed to measure comfort ends up influencing health and housing conditions. And it can fall in strange ways on people who are not especially wealthy, especially in dense urban areas with shared buildings and awkward layouts. The tax doesn't always see fairness. It sees numbers. And numbers, like cats, do not care about your feelings. There's also a kind of social theater to it. Windows become a public symbol. Too many windows and you look wealthy enough to be taxed. Too few and you look like you're hiding, or like you've been forced into a darker life. In some places, the choices are not purely financial. They become part of how you appear in your community, which is a weird burden to place on a window, an object that has never asked for responsibility. A window just wants to be a window. It wants to let in light and occasionally make a squeaky noise when opened. It does not want to be a statement. If your mind is still awake enough for an extra small absurd detail, consider the material side. Glass itself was not always cheap. Frames and shutters require wood and craftsmanship. So a window is already a kind of investment. Then the tax turns that investment into a recurring expense. It is like buying something once and then being reminded of it annually by someone with a ledger. Which is honestly an experience many people are still familiar with, just with different objects. History has a talent for repeating the same emotional shape using new furniture. Over time, as with many policies, enforcement shifts, priorities shift, people crumble. Exceptions appear, critics argue about consequences, supporters argue about necessity, and slowly, the tax becomes a kind of background hum, still there, still annoying, but woven into the fabric of how things are done. Some people barely notice because their homes are small. Others notice every day because they live in rooms that feel like evening at midday. It's a system that turns architecture into a long, quiet negotiation between private life and public finance. And then, as quietly as it entered, the policy eventually fades. Not with fireworks. Not with a triumphant announcement that everyone now deserves sunlight. It fades through reforms, replacements, and the slow recognition that certain kinds of taxation create strange incentives. The window tax is remembered partly because it is so easy to visualize. You can point at a bricked up rectangle and say, that was once light, that was once air, that was once a view. And then someone, somewhere, decided it was also money. So imagine a final scene that is almost still. A street at dusk. The buildings sitting calmly, some with full faces of glass, some with scars where openings used to be. Inside one house, someone lights a candle earlier than they would have liked, because the room is dim. Inside another, someone sits near a remaining window like it's a prized object, because in a way it is. Outside, the world continues, indifferent. The ledger closes, the pencil rests. The inspector goes home, probably to a house with its own counted rectangles. And if you let the thought soften, you can feel how history often works, not as a series of dramatic moments, but as long, quiet pressures that reshape ordinary life. A tax here, a definition there, a brick laid into an opening, a room made slightly darker, a habit adjusted, and then, eventually, the policy drifts away, but the walls remember. The street remembers. The strange little architecture of avoidance remains, like a sleepy footprint in stone. The fire steadies, the air settles, and the night keeps its soft, unhurried attention on all those bricked-up windows, as if it is counting them too, slowly, without needing to write anything down. You might not expect an entire society to feel quietly tired because someone changed the shape of the week, but that is more or less what happened when revolutionary France decided that time itself could be improved with better labeling. Not faster time, not more time, just tidier time. The kind of tidiness that looks elegant on paper and then sits heavily in the human body like a slightly too warm blanket. Imagine a desk, a candle that behaves politely, a pen that scratches in slow confidence. Somewhere nearby, a clock keeps doing what clocks do, which is to insist on numbers, even when people keep arguing about which numbers should matter. And if you're listening from somewhere comfortable, at a time when your day has stopped expecting things from you, you can let this be what it is. A soft tour through the most unexciting part of a revolution, the paperwork part, the calendar part, the part where someone says with a straight face, actually, we've improved Tuesday. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Not revolutionary time, just your ordinary time, the kind that still has the nerve to call something Monday. If you're still awake by the time we start, describing how France tried to make clocks count to 10 like they were shy, you can subscribe. Or don't, it's fine. You're already here, and this is the kind of topic that doesn't chase anyone. It simply sits in a corner, quietly counting days. The revolutionary calendar, often called the French Republican, calendar arrived with the careful enthusiasm of people who believe the old world can be reorganized. If you just rename enough things, they didn't only want new laws and new leaders, they wanted new rhythms, a new baseline, a new normal that didn't smell like the old regime, the old church calendar, the old saints' days, the old way of measuring life as if it belonged to someone else's tradition. So they reached for something incredibly intimate, the way a year moves through your hands. The year was divided into 12 months of 30 days each, because 30 is a very cooperative number, and cooperation was the mood they were going for. Months were renamed with a kind of poetic practicality names tied to weather and agriculture rather than emperors or gods. You get months like Vendemiaire, Brumaire, Frumiere names that sound like you're exhaling into cold air. Then Nives, Pluvies, Ventes, snowy, rainy, windy. Then germinal, floreal, prairial, germination, flowers, meadows. Then Messidor, Thermidor, Fructidor harvest, heat, fruit. It's almost soothing, honestly, like a nature documentary narrated by a committee. But the truly sleepy twist is not the month names, it's the week. They replaced the 7-day week with a 10-day cycle called a decade. 10 days on, then 1 day of rest at the end of the decade, the decadi. Instead of Sunday, you get decadi. It sounds like a pastry. It is not a pastry. It is the day you are finally allowed to sit down without the calendar looking disappointed in you. If you've ever tried to move your sleep schedule by even 1 hour, you know how stubborn the body can be. Now imagine moving it by 3 days of work. Under the old rhythm, you work 6 days and then got a rest day. Under the new one, you work 9 days and then got a rest day. On paper, it's just arithmetic. In practice, it's a long, quiet sigh spreading through shops, farms, and workshops. You can almost hear people thinking, this is a revolution, and yet I am mostly just tired. And the decade wasn't only a work pattern, it was a statement. A way of pushing religion out of the week by removing Sunday as a special anchor. When you change the week, you change the habit. When you change the habit, you change the body. And when you change the body, you find out very quickly whether your new system is genuinely loved or merely obeyed. The calendar also tried to make each day feel clean and rational. Even the names of the days were adjusted because why stop at months? In place of the familiar weekly cycle, you get day names that basically count. Primidi, duodi, tridi, quartidi, quintidi, sextidi, septidi, octidi, nonidi, decadi. It's like your week is now a polite counting exercise. It's simple. It's logical. It is also, after a while, deeply unromantic. You can't say, we'll meet on Thursday, with any emotional meaning. You have to say, we'll meet on Quintidi, which sounds like you are scheduling a dentist appointment for a very patient ghost. Some people probably enjoyed the order of it. People do love order, especially when the world feels unstable. A neat calendar can feel like a handrail. But for many others, it likely felt like being asked to change the language of your own life. Birthdays, market days, feast days, the quiet traditions of we do this on this day, suddenly had to be translated into a new system that didn't care about your grandmother's sense of time. And the new calendar didn't stop at months and weeks. It also tried to tidy the leftover days. Since 12 months of 30 days gives you 360 days, you still need a few extra to reach the full solar year. Those extra days became a special set at the end of the year, often called the complementary days, and sometimes referred to as the sans culottes. Instead of random extra days, they became a tiny festival of civic virtues, celebrations for things like virtue, genius, labor, and other concepts that sound admirable and also slightly exhausting to celebrate formally. Imagine being told with official seriousness that today is celebration of labor. Many people would respond by resting quietly, in protest or in agreement. It's hard to tell. Rest can look like many things. And then, as if that weren't enough, the revolution also flirted with decimal time. Not just a decimal calendar, a decimal clock. The day would be divided into 10 hours, each hour into 100 minutes, each minute into 100 seconds. This is the part where your brain can either become curious or decide it wants to sleep immediately. Both reactions are acceptable. Decimal time has a certain elegance. A day becomes a clean number. Calculations become simpler. Everything aligns. The problem is that the sun does not care about elegance, and neither do people who have to wake up, bake bread, and sell it before it goes stale. The old clock was already woven into routines. When you change the clock, you're asking every person to relearn when morning feels like morning. You are also asking every clockmaker to reinvent their livelihood, which is a bold move if you want the clocks to keep working. Some decimal clocks were made, some were displayed. Some people tried, and many others likely did what humans always do when the official system is too inconvenient. They quietly kept using the old system in their heads. Officially, it is primity. In your heart, it is Tuesday. Officially, the day has 10 hours. In your kitchen, it is still stubbornly noon. What is fascinating in a very boring way is how a calendar reveals what a state thinks it can control. Taxes, armies, borders, these are obvious. But the calendar is a softer kind of control. It touches contracts, pay schedules, market rhythms, and the tiny mental map everyone carries. If you can get people to agree on what day it is, you've already made a kind of peace with reality. If you can't, reality remains slightly ungoverned, like a cat refusing to come inside. So you can picture the practical friction. Merchants dealing with invoices dated in the new system, customers still speaking in the old. A rural priest and a local official disagreeing about what day a gathering should happen. Farmers timing planting and harvest by weather as always, while the calendar insists on its poetic month names like it's trying to help. The months, at least, were charming. It is hard to stay angry at Florial. Florial sounds like a gentle room. But day 10 of the work cycle is less charming when your hands are tired and you are still not allowed to treat the day as special until the calendar says so. And yet, there is a sleepy beauty in the attempt. The revolutionary mind looked at time and thought, we can make this more rational, more natural, less tied to superstition, less tied to kings and saints. It's almost tender, like someone reorganizing a messy shelf at 2 a.m. because the world feels too chaotic, and if the jars are aligned, maybe the mind can breathe. But reorganizing time is not the same as reorganizing a shelf. Time pushes back, people push back, habits push back, even language pushes back. You can rename months, but you can't rename the feeling of a week ending. You can declare a decade, but you can't easily erase the relief people feel after 6 days of work, because that relief lives in muscles, not in documents. Over the years, the calendar became a real system in administration. It appeared on decrees. It structured official life. It stamped itself into the paper trail of the era, which is why historians keep bumping into it like a slightly inconvenient piece of furniture. When you read documents dated Thermidor or Brumaire, you feel the revolution's ambition reaching through time like a hand asking you to participate. You have to translate the date. You have to do the little conversion. You become briefly part of the administrative effort, which is not the most glamorous form of historical empathy, but it is very accurate. And then quietly it ended. Not because everyone suddenly agreed that old calendars were emotionally superior. It ended because the old rhythm was stubborn, and because political tides shifted, and because systems that require constant translation eventually lose energy. The Republican calendar was used for years, and then, under Napoleon, it was abolished and France returned to the Gregorian calendar. Time snapped back into its older shape, like a rubber band returning to its familiar tension. If you want to imagine the moment, imagine a clerk who has spent years writing the new dates, suddenly being told to write January again. Imagine a clock face that returns to 12 hours as if nothing happened. Imagine people who never fully stopped using the old terms, quietly nodding as if to say, yes, of course. We always knew what day it really was. And imagine a few others perhaps feeling a small pang of loss because the month names were genuinely lovely and because there is Something appealing about the idea that the year belongs to wind and rain and flowers rather than to emperors. The whole story, if you let it stay calm, is less about grand ideology and more about the soft tyranny of routine. It's about how revolutions reach for big symbols and then meet the humble reality of breakfast. It's hard to convince someone that the week is 10 days long when they are already counting the days until they can rest. It's hard to make Ducati replace Sunday when Sunday is already living inside family habits, inside market schedules, inside the way people decide when life can slow down. And maybe that's the most bedtime friendly lesson here. That time is not only a measurement, it is a comfort. It is the thing you lean on without noticing. When it changes, you feel it in small ways. When you're allowed to pause, when you expect company, when you prepare food, when you forgive yourself for not doing more. A calendar is a public document, but it becomes private the moment it enters your home. So let the scene soften again. A quiet room, a candle, or maybe just the glow of whatever light you have nearby. Someone somewhere in the late 1790s writes a date at the top of a page, Vintes. Outside, the wind agrees with the name because the wind is polite like that. The person writing the date may feel, briefly, that the world is being reordered into something clean. Then someone calls them for dinner, and dinner arrives with the same old human timing it always has. The pen pauses, the page waits. The day moves forward whether it is called Primity or Monday. The body continues to want rest on a familiar rhythm, even if the official calendar insists it has been upgraded. And as you listen, you can let your own mind do what minds do best at night. Release the need to keep track. Let the numbers drift. Let the months blur into weather. Let the week stretch and soften until it doesn't matter how many days it contains. The clocks can argue with themselves somewhere else. Here, the minutes can be as long as they want. The air stays still. The room stays quiet. And time, whatever it is called, keeps moving gently without asking you to participate. You might not expect an entire legal system to hinge on something as gentle as a slightly warm mug of ale, but for a long time, in a lot of places, it did. Not because people were dramatic about beer, exactly. Mostly because people were practical about beer, which is its own quiet kind of drama. The kind that happens in ledgers and under doorways and in the tired sigh of someone who discovers their pint is not in fact a pint. Imagine an old street that has learned the shape of footsteps. A wooden door that creaks in a way that sounds like it remembers everyone. A fire that pops once, politely, as if to prove it is still awake. And somewhere on a rough table, a cup that is heavier than it looks, because it is trying to be honest. The cup is trying to say, with its weight and its shape, I contain the amount I claim to contain. This is the sort of thing that seems obvious until you remember humans and markets and the small temptations of shaving a measurement down by a finger's width. Where are you listening from and what time is it there? If you're still awake by the time we get to the part where officials seriously consider whether a beer should cling to a bench, feel free to subscribe, or don't. It's fine. The ale will be here either way, and it does not take rejection personally. In medieval and early modern towns, the problem wasn't only that people wanted ale. The problem was that people needed ale, and they needed it predictably. Water was not always a reliable friend, and beer was, at the very least, a familiar one. Ale and beer, depending on region and era, could be weak enough that you could treat them like a daily beverage rather than an event. And when something becomes daily, it becomes measurable. Not poetic measurable, like a generous splash. Official measurable, like a quart, a gallon, a pint, and other words that sound calm until you realize they can start arguments at noon. So you get rules, you get standards. You get the slow birth of the idea that a government should care about how much liquid is in your cup, which is both comforting and slightly intrusive, like someone adjusting your pillow while you're trying to sleep. In England, one of the most famous examples is the Assize of Bread and Ale, a set of regulations that tried to connect price and quality to the cost of grain. It's the kind of law that makes you feel sleepy just hearing the title, because it sounds like a person in a robe reading aloud from a very long page, while everyone else pretends they are kneeling. Bread and ale were basic enough that people got nervous when they were unfair. If bread is too expensive, people notice. If ale is watered down, people also notice, though they may notice more slowly, which can make it feel even more personal when they finally do. And because people noticed, towns appointed people to notice on purpose. Officials whose job was to make sure ale was sold at the correct price, in the correct measure, and with a quality that didn't insult the community too openly. These officials have one of the most charmingly specific titles in history, ale conners, sometimes also called ale tasters. The word conner may come from can, as in a vessel, or from old terms for examining. Either way, it suggests someone whose life purpose is to be near a cup long enough to take it seriously. Picture the ale conner arriving, not like a dramatic inspector in a modern film, more like a neighbor with authority. A person with a small sense of duty and a larger sense that rules must be kept, because otherwise everyone will quietly cheat. The ale cutter might carry a staff or a badge or nothing at all, because sometimes the only thing you need is the town's agreement that you are, today, the person who gets to say, "This is not good enough." A lot of the work was simple. Checking measures, comparing cups and jugs to official standards, looking for marks on tankards, because stamped marks were the quiet language of honesty. A pewter measure with a little official symbol is a sleepy form of technology. No gears, no electricity, just a piece of metal saying, "I have been verified, please stop arguing." The alehouse itself was not always a romantic place. Sometimes it was warm and communal. Sometimes it was cramped and smoky. Sometimes it smelled like damp wool, yeast, and a slight misunderstanding. But it mattered. People met there. News passed there. Deals were whispered there. Arguments began there and then wandered home, still arguing. The alehouse was where the social world softened at the edges, and that softness needed boundaries. Because humans, when softened, can get louder. So the first little scene, the first quiet problem, is the mug, the measure. The simple question of, how much did you just sell me? A cup can be thick-walled, which means it looks full while holding less. A mug can be filled with foam, which is technically part of the drink, but also emotionally feels like a trick. A jug can be tilted in a way that makes the pour seem generous while the quantity is, in fact, discreetly modest. These are tiny acts. They are not epic betrayals. They are the small mathematics of survival and profit. Now the second scene drifts in, and it is the part where inspection becomes creative, because humans do not stop at measuring. Humans also tell stories about measuring, and sometimes those stories grow legs and walk through centuries. There is a famous tale told often enough that it has become almost ceremonial about ale conners testing beer by pouring it onto a bench and then sitting in it. The idea is that if the ale was watered down too much, it wouldn't be sticky, and if it had enough malted goodness, it would cling, and the inspector's leather breeches would stick to the bench when they stood up. It is an image that is both ridiculous and strangely believable, which is the perfect combination for something that might be true in spirit, even if it isn't consistently documented in detail. Whether or not this was a standard practice everywhere, the story itself tells you something sleepy and important. People wanted a method that felt physical, not just numbers on a page, a test that your body could perform. If you have ever judged a blanket by rubbing it between your fingers, you understand. We trust texture. We trust the feeling of, this seems right. Medieval life was full of that kind of trust, because instruments were limited and the body was always available. More reliably documented is the idea of tasting and smelling. Ale tasters did, in fact, taste. And if you think about it, This is an oddly public job. You drink someone's product with official seriousness, and then you have to say something about it. You have to politely declare whether it is too sour, too weak, too strong, too suspicious. And you have to do it in a room where the brewer may be standing very still, listening in the way people listen when their pride is on the table. Brewing itself was a craft that sat between the ordinary and the slightly magical. You take grain, you heat water, you cook sugars, you add yeast, sometimes without fully naming it, and you wait. It bubbles. It changes. It becomes something else. People understood enough to do it reliably, but not always enough to explain it in modern scientific terms, which means a lot of brewing knowledge lived as habit, as inherited practice, as do it this way because it works. If you've ever learned something like that folding dough, seasoning food, fixing something by feel, it can be deeply competent and deeply untheoretical at the same time. And because brewing could vary, the law tried to control it with the tools it had. Standards, prices, inspections, fines. Sometimes the concern was strength. Sometimes it was adulteration. Not every brewer was evil, but some were tempted to stretch a batch, especially if grain was expensive. You could water it down. You could use cheaper ingredients. You can make a drink that technically qualifies as ale if nobody asked too many questions. The law's job was to ask questions on behalf of everyone who didn't want to fight about it personally. Then you get the quiet paper world, records of fines, statements of complaint, little notes that say, essentially, on this day, this person sold ale for too much, or this ale was unfit. Imagine how boring it is to be the person who writes that down. Imagine how important it feels to the person who drank the bad ale. History often lives at that exact intersection, tedious recording of deeply felt minor inconveniences. Now the third scene glides in, and it's the courtroom without the drama. Not a grand trial, more like the slow machinery of local governance. The manor court, the town court, the officials who meet and listen and decide what is acceptable. The law here isn't thunder. It's housekeeping. If an alehouse broke rules, it might be presented at a court, meaning someone formally reported it. This could come from officials or from neighbors. The language is calm. The consequences are not always calm, but they are often practical. A fine, a warning, sometimes the loss of a right to sell. It's the medieval version of please stop doing that, but with more parchment. And there's something quietly funny about how much energy communities put into regulating everyday pleasures. Not in a joyless way, in a protective way. In a we don't mind that people drink, but we do mind being cheated way. It's like modern consumer protection, just with fewer logos and more soot. Measurements, too, were a whole universe. Even the word gallon shifts and wobbles across time and place. There were different gallons for different products in different contexts. A wine gallon and an ale gallon could be different. Imagine being a tired merchant trying to remember which gallon applies to which liquid. This is the kind of confusion that makes a person long for bed. The cup becomes not just a cup, but a negotiation between custom and law, between local practice and royal decree, between what people say and what people can prove. And then there's the simple fact that a lot of medieval life was not fully standardized. Towns had their own habits. Regions had their own expectations. The law could declare something, but practice might drift. People might comply in public and translate in private. They might use official measures when the inspector is nearby and use familiar measures when among friends. In other words, they did what people do now with rules they respect in principle and ignore in detail. The ale cunner, standing with a mug, becomes a symbol of the state's reach into daily life, but also of the state's dependence on local community, because the ale cunner is not a distant bureaucrat. The ale cunner is someone you might see at the market, someone whose cousin might marry your cousin, someone whose opinion matters not only because it's official, but because it lives socially. This makes enforcement both easier and more awkward. Easier because everyone knows you. Awkward because everyone knows you. And so the law works through routine, through repetition, through a rhythm that is almost sleepy: check, taste, measure, record, fine, repeat. It's not an epic battle between freedom and tyranny. It is a mild struggle between the human desire to stretch resources and the human dislike of being stretched by someone else as dishonesty. Now the fourth scene settles in, softer, quieter, and slightly sad in the way that only practical history can be sad. Because even if everything is done correctly, the right measure, the right price, the right quality, there are still things a rule cannot buy back. Trust, for example. Once someone believes an alehouse cheats, they don't forget quickly. They might still come because the alehouse is close and the night is cold, but they will come with a small reservation tucked in their chest. They will watch the pour. They will listen for the sound of the mug on the table. They will count their coins more carefully. It becomes a habit, and habits are difficult to reverse. The law can fine a brewer. The law can correct a measure. The law can force a certain public apology, but it can't quite restore the invisible ease a community has when it believes everyone is playing fairly. A town can survive a lot, but it grows tired when every transaction feels like a small test. It's similar to the modern world in a quiet way. If you've ever had a phone plan that promised unlimited and then quietly became limited, you know the feeling. You still use it, you still pay, but you never fully believe the word unlimited again. Medieval people too learned how words can be slippery when money is involved. The difference is that their unlimited was a mug that was supposed to be full. And yet, despite all the enforcement, alehouses continued. Brewing continued. People continued to gather, to talk, to argue gently, to laugh quietly, to stare into a fire and say nothing at all. The law's presence didn't erase the softness of the social ritual. It simply hovered near it, like a reminder that even comfort has rules. So imagine the end of a long day. A person sits in an alehouse not to stir trouble, but to let the world loosen. They lift a mug that has, ideally, been measured and approved. The drink tastes how it should. Not miraculous, just right. The ale cunner somewhere has already done their slow work, and nobody is thinking about them anymore, which is the greatest success an inspector can have. The coins clink softly. The bench holds steady. Nobody tests stickiness today, because today nobody needs to. Outside, the street is dark and ordinary. Inside, the room hums with low voices. The law, for once, does not feel like a threat. It feels like background. Like the weight of the mug. Like the simple agreement that we all want the same basic thing: warmth, fairness, and a night that doesn't demand too much. And as you listen, you can let the whole subject fade into that gentle hum. The words, assize, and ale cunner can become soft sounds like old wooden beams settling. The measurements can blur. The paperwork can drift away into a quiet stack of pages nobody reads anymore. The fire pops once, politely. The mug sits where it sits. The room stays calm. And the history keeps doing what it does best for sleep, continuing quietly without needing you to stay awake for the ending. You might not expect an entire country to outsource its legal system to one person's memory, but for a long time in Iceland, that was a perfectly respectable plan, not a loud plan, not a glamorous plan, just a plan that involved one human being standing in the wind and calmly remembering what the law was supposed to be, while everyone else pretended this was normal because it was for them. If you're listening somewhere quiet, imagine a low hill, a cold sky, and a gathering that is technically a parliament, but also feels like an extremely organized outdoor meeting where nobody brought enough blankets. Somewhere nearby, water moves over rock, and the air has that clean, indifferent smell that says, yes, people are here, but the landscape did not invite them. And before we settle in, where are you listening from? and what time is it there. If you still awake when we get to the part where legal authority involves a very specific rock and a lot of patient standing, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Honestly, conserving energy is a valid historical practice. In the early Icelandic Commonwealth, the law wasn't primarily something you looked up in a book the way you might scroll through terms and conditions at 2 a.m., half hoping the screen will dim itself out of mercy. The law was, at least in a very real way, something you heard. Something you listened to again and again until it lived in your head with the same stubbornness as a song you didn't ask to learn. This is where the law speaker comes in. In Old Norse, the title is usually given as the skuma, literally a law sayer, which is pleasingly direct, not a law writer, not a law printer, a law sayer. A person whose job is to say the law out loud in public with enough clarity and steadiness that everyone can pretend the law is solid, even if the weather is doing its best to make everything feel temporary. It's a strange kind of power if you think about it slowly. The law speaker isn't powerful because they have a sword. They're powerful because they have a reliable mental filing cabinet. And because everyone agrees to treat that filing cabinet as a shared resource. It is like a community deciding that the Wi-Fi password will live in one person's brain and everyone will be polite and not panic about it. The setting for this, the famous Alþingi often called the Alþing, is also quietly odd. It's not a castle hall with banners and chandeliers. It's an assembly site traditionally associated with Lingvellir, a place where the ground is dramatic in a calm way, cracks, ridges, a sense that the earth has opinions. People would travel there for a season, bringing tents, supplies, complaints, and the kind of patience you develop when travel takes time and you can just hop on a quick call. And the first sleepy detail to hold gently is this: the law was presented in pieces over time. Tradition says the law speaker recited a portion of the law each year, so that over a few years the whole law would be spoken. This makes the legal system feel less like a sharp instrument and more like a slow lullaby everyone has to attend. Not because it's soothing exactly, but because repetition has that effect on the mind. You hear it, you absorb it, you drift. It also means that law is, in a literal way, an event. Imagine planning your year around the fact that the law will be said out loud in summer, outdoors, in a particular place. Today, we complain when an app updates without asking. Back then, an update to law might arrive as a human voice carried by wind while someone tries not to sneeze. The law speaker would sit or stand at a spot associated with this job, often referred to in sources as the law rock, the Lagberg. It is difficult not to smile softly at the fact that a rock can be a legal platform. A rock is wonderfully non-digital. It does not crash. It does not require charging. It does not ask you to accept cookies. It simply exists, and if you stand on it, you are on it, and everyone can see that you are officially on the rock. So imagine the law speaker there, speaking carefully, trying to keep the cadence even. Not because they're performing for applause, but because a calm pace is how you make important words stick. Around them, people listen in the way people listen when they have traveled far and want the trip to feel worth it. Some are more attentive than others. Some are thinking about their feet. Some are thinking about their neighbor's sheep. But they're there, and that matters. Now, the second drift in this quiet system is that the law speaker is not working alone in the way we imagine officials working alone. Icelandic society at the time was deeply networked through families, chieftaincies, alliances, soft webs of obligation. The law, too, lived in that web. The law speaker's public recitation gave the law a spine, but the flesh of it, the actual enforcement and negotiation, was carried by people and their relationships. Disputes, for example, often involved a lot of procedure. Not dramatic courtroom yelling, more like a structured way of saying, "This happened, here are my witnesses. Here's what I claim, here is what I demand." and here is why it should be considered reasonable. The procedure itself is part of the point. When you cannot count on a centralized police force, you count on formal steps. A community can be held together by rules about how to complain. There's a sleepy irony here. The law in such a society is both extremely serious and extremely dependent on everyone staying somewhat polite. Even when they're angry, they have to play the legal game, because the legal game is how the community avoids collapsing into endless personal arguments. The rules become a shared language, like a ritual. You do not necessarily do it because you love ritual. You do it because it's better than alternatives, and because everyone else expects it. And this is where you start noticing the quiet economy of compensation and settlement. Not the loud part, the boring part. The part where people talk about payments, guarantees, deadlines, and what counts as acceptable restitution. There's something oddly modern about it, like a very old version of customer support. Except the ticket is your family's dignity, and the resolution is a carefully negotiated outcome that nobody loves but everyone can tolerate. If you're still awake, let yourself notice how many systems in history boil down to this. Humans trying to turn emotional problems into manageable numbers, because numbers are easier to carry than rage. Not easy, but easier. Then, in the third gentle shift, we drift toward how memory becomes infrastructure. A law speaker, to be useful, has to remember not only the words, but the order, the emphasis, the correct phrasing. In cultures where writing exists, but isn't always the primary tool for public law, the prestige of memory can be enormous. Memory is proof. Memory is legitimacy. Memory is a kind of public service, like maintaining a bridge, except the bridge is made of sentences. And because memory is human, it also introduces a mild anxiety that nobody wants to say out loud. What if the law speaker forgets? What if they miss a clause? What if they phrase something slightly wrong? What if they are tired or hungry, or distracted by the fact that it is windy in exactly the way wind loves to be when you trying to sound authoritative? This is part of why the recitation is public. Public speaking is, in a strange way, a form of redundancy. If enough people hear the law often enough, the law doesn't live only in one head. It spreads. It becomes community property. Even if the law speaker is the official mouthpiece, the crowd is the backup storage. Not everyone knows everything, but enough people know enough to keep the general shape intact. Also, the legal culture likely involved advisors and learned individuals, people who knew procedure, who understood customary rules, who could argue points and quote precedent. The law speaker is a symbol, but the legal mind of a society is a distributed thing. It lives in people who enjoy details, which is a sentence that quietly explains why history survives at all. The meetings themselves, these assemblies, weren't only about disputes. They were also about trade, news, social bonds, marriage arrangements, and the slow maintenance of a shared world. This is important because it means the law did not float above life like a noble abstraction. It sat inside life like a heavy cloak you wear because it's cold, even if it's a bit awkward. You can picture the small, unglamorous moments: someone boiling a pot, someone patching a tent, someone trying to keep smoked food dry, someone listening to a case while also thinking about whether their horse is behaving, someone nodding solemnly at legal language and then immediately asking where the best dried fish is being sold. This is not disrespect. This is simply how humans operate. Our brains can carry seriousness and snack planning at the same time. Now, the fourth and final soft drift is the part where, after all the procedure and recitation and public posture, life continues. The law has been said. The disputes have been heard. Some settlements have been arranged. Some grudges have been postponed into the future, which is also a kind of outcome. People pack up. They travel back across distances that make a modern commute look like a gentle stroll. And the law goes with them, not as a book in a bag, but as a set of remembered phrases, a sense of what is permitted, what is expected, what will be socially supported if trouble starts. There's a tender boredom to that, not because it's meaningless, but because it's so practical. History is often practical in ways that feel almost too plain. A society keeps itself together not by constant heroics, but by routines, by showing up, by listening, by accepting that a rock can be a podium and a person can be a living statue. And if you let your mind soften, you can see the law speaker not as a dramatic figure, but as something quieter, a human metronome, a voice that keeps time, a person who holds the community's shared agreements in their mouth and releases them slowly into the air, as if the air itself can store them for a while. It's also comforting, in a strange way, to think about how much trust this requires. People had to believe that words matter, that procedure matters, that public recitation matters. Not because it is perfect, but because it is better than improvising justice in the heat of emotion. The law is a slow tool. It asks everyone to slow down with it. In a world where survival already forces slowness because travel is slow, seasons are slow, growth is slow, maybe it fits. Maybe it feels natural to let your rules be slow too. So imagine the last moments of the assembly season. The light has shifted, the air has cooled. The crowd thins. The law rock sits there, unchanged, as rocks like to do. The law speaker's voice is no longer moving through the air, but the echo of it is. Still in people's heads, mixed with other echoes. Footsteps water quiet conversations, the sound of coins, the sound of cloth being folded, the faint creak of wood. And somewhere, someone repeats a phrase they heard. Not because they're trying to be scholarly, but because repetition is how you keep something. It's how you carry it home. The law becomes less like a strict command and more like a familiar rhythm, the kind you can fall asleep to if you stop trying to hold every word sharply. The wind keeps moving. The ground keeps its patient cracks. The society, for another year, keeps itself stitched together with memory and habit and the gentle, stubborn idea that saying the rules out loud can be enough. And as you listen, you don't need to stay alert for a big ending because there isn't one. Just the quiet continuation of people doing what people always do, arguing, agreeing, forgetting, remembering under a wide sky that does not hurry them, and a history that can keep murmuring long after you've drifted off.